On October 24th, 2014, Digital Extremes released Update 15.0, the Archwing update. If I had to pick a point on the Warframe timeline where I think things started to change, I would pick this. Archwing was the start of, in my opinion, many poorly thought out additions to Warframe. Even when it came out, complaints about the controls were rampant and players quickly realized that the Archwing itself was a content island. In retrospect, this was the start of a pattern. DE would release a new game mode to a ton of hype, people actually got their hands on it, realized it sucked, and DE all but dropped it. I wouldn't call this era of Warframe bad per se, because it had a lot of good parts, as DE was still adding new weapons and frames that became beloved, but I would call this era at least slightly mixed. The game started to get a lot of additions that took a ton of time, but got mixed reactions from the player base. But with the release of 1999, this era of Warframe has come to an end. So, let's talk about Warframe's past and how we got here. First of all, I want to talk about what I think Warframe did badly in the past, and then I'll talk about what it does well now. Warframe is a game that expects the player to play a lot, but it's an MMO, so that's par for the course. But my problem with past Warframe updates is that most of them added content that wasn't enjoyable, but was forced upon the player. A lot of this content ends up feeling artificial. An example would be Railjack. Besides Railjack itself, there's not really a reason to actually go get one. But guess what? If you want to get through the new war, and you will, you have to get one. Same deal with Necromechs. These mechanics felt like they were being shoved down our throats. It felt like DE kept on adding new mechanics they desperately wanted their player base to engage with, so they just forced us to. If you want to get to the latest story quest, you have to get a Necromech, and you have to get a Railjack. Even now, to some percent, this exists. With the new adversary system, you have to fight your adversary in a Railjack mission. Why does this have to be Railjack? Why can't it just be a normal assassination mission, or some kind of new mission type? I mean, the Techrot adversary is basically already a new mission type. Why not cut out the Railjack from the start? Also, I think the player base at large has finally grown disillusioned with the open worlds, but so much of their content still has a ton of mods you can't get anywhere else. Personally, I'd really love it if DE added some of these mods to other drop tables. We'll just have to tell Kanzu his lunch will have to wait. And while we're on the topic of Kanzu, I have to talk about the open worlds in more detail because they are a major part of what makes this era of Warframe so mixed. Honestly, I really didn't want to, because there's a lot of bad things to say about them, and quite frankly, I'm lazy, and I don't feel like writing an extra 4 pages, but here we go. Warframe at this point is a power fantasy game where the goal is to kill everything as fast as possible. While it has beautiful tile sets, it's rare to actually stop and smell the roses. With the fast parkour options and a double jump, the whole tile set is usually a blur as you rush to the end. So with that being said, how does an open world fit in Warframe? I think that the parkour system already makes an open world difficult to make, because part of the fun of an open world is seeing something cool and then going, how do I get up there? But this doesn't work for Warframe because our mobility options are too expansive. Now, maybe you could make this work in Warframe's favor if you designed an extremely vertical world that required advanced parkour skills to traverse. Unfortunately though, DE never did that. All of the open worlds are, for the most part, flat. Even in the case of, say, the Ravine on Deimos, you can just arc-wing your way out. So I think there are cracks in how an open world would function in Warframe, and they didn't resolve these issues. Exploring an open world isn't really satisfying if you can fly across the whole thing in just a few minutes. Did DE adapt the gameplay of Warframe into open world? No. They just copy-pasted the same type of mission into an open world. What we end up with is missions that play exactly the same as linear tile sets, but now we're spending several minutes flying or walking to each objective. In fact, I think DE was aware of this problem to some extent because they gave us the ability to fly and completely ignored the open world. Then, they made Archwing launchers have infinite uses, probably from people saying it was too annoying to traverse the world. In terms of exploration, DE made no attempt to incorporate it. First of all, the game gives you a map with everything labeled on it, so you already know where everything is, so what's the point? And even if you did want to go around and blow up a base or whatever, why even bother? There's nothing interesting in them. And then there's the fishing, mining, and hunting aspects. If you asked an AI to make an open world game using the most commonly found mechanics, this is what you would get. These mechanics are here, but they have no substance. In something like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, these things flow naturally into the rest of the game. In other games, you'll have a natural moment where you see a vein or a fish and then decide to engage with the mechanic, but this never happens in Warframe. Anytime you go mining, fishing, or hunting, you enter the open world with the explicit intent to do these things, which breaks the flow. When you find a cave in Tears of the Kingdom, you get excited because it might have materials that you'll need in general. But this doesn't happen in Warframe for two reasons. One, you're never just out and about exploring the world because there's simply no reason to. Two, a lot of the materials you get just aren't that exciting. In Warframe, there are only a few materials that are universally useful and thus could be quickly recognized by the player as cool loot. But none of the open world's mining or fishing drop these materials. Instead, most of the materials in the open world areas are only useful for that area, and it's not immediately obvious what their use is. Like, cool, I got 10 grok drool, what does that even do? It sounds like a meme joke, like, oh, she's grokking till I drool or something. And if you're gonna Google it, you better not leave out the drool part, or you'll get weird results about some AI chatbot made by a guy who makes very expensive fancy fireworks. Anyway, my point is, nothing about the open world feels natural. The mining, hunting, and fishing feel thrown in there because DE looked at other open worlds and said, of course, we have to put these things in our open world because it's a staple of the genre. It almost reminds me of old video games coming out in the early console days where they put in a score because arcade games did, or how games used lives a long time after arcades and it was just a holdover that wasn't really necessary. I am tired of living in a capitalist hellhole where people recommend shitty products that they will never use and have never actually used in their life. So, because I am 5 foot 4 inches of pure hatred, I am going to introduce what I am calling the anti-sponsor segment. In the anti-sponsor segment, rather than shill a corporate product I will never touch in my life, I am instead going to shit on a corporate product I will never touch in my life. Today's anti-sponsor, and the first ever anti-sponsor as far as I'm aware, is Opera GX. You've probably heard of this browser, and if you haven't, you're lucky. Opera GX, or as I like to call it, Google Chrome, because it's Google Chrome, claims to protect your privacy, but doesn't. It also claims to perform better than Chrome, but doesn't. So if you want a browser that just straight up lies to you, well, here you go, you fucking weirdo. If you want a browser that actually protects your privacy, honestly, at this point, I would just go outside and bang some rocks together and say some slurs. It's basically Twitter, and it's private. These days, getting a browser that genuinely protects your privacy is getting more and more difficult, even with alternatives like Firefox and Brave. But, like I just mentioned, if you want a browser that protects your privacy better than Opera GX ever will, use Firefox, use Brave. If you want a browser that actually outperforms Chrome, that's also something that's somewhat difficult to find these days, but there is Firefox, and there's also LibreWolf, which I believe is also based off of Firefox. So those are probably better alternatives. Anyways, that is the end of today's anti-sponsor segment. Don't use Opera GX. Don't listen to all the people who are shilling it. It's shilled because they want to steal people's data by having everybody download it. If you really want to have Naruto sounds on your browser, you can make it happen with Google Chrome, or you can just go to therapy. If you have good insurance, it's not that much. My therapist pays it's $20 copay, honestly. It's not that much. Just go to therapy, guys. Don't use BetterHelp either. That'll be another anti-sponsor segment. Anyways, that's it for today's anti-sponsor segment. Back to the video. Unfortunately, though, these updates that added the open worlds took up a major part of updates for years. There were definitely some good updates here and there, like the Jupiter tileset update, but we continued to get stuff like Necromech, Railjack, Cetus, Fortuna, and Deimos, all of which fall flat. Necromechs can only be used for a small subset of missions, Railjack is ignored and only used for adversaries, and Cetus, Fortuna, and Deimos are only one for the rewards and not because of the open world aspects. With all of this said, things started to look up with the final open world, Duviri. I noticed a change with the release of the Duviri Paradox. There was still an open world, but it was by far the smallest, and it was almost completely ignorable. On top of that, the circuit was a great update to the game, and it also added Incarna weapons, which I will slob over their knob later. Honestly, this was the first major content update I was excited for in a long time. It didn't feel like it added a load of random crap, it actually added stuff that fit in with the rest of the game. But another big thing with this update was the introduction of the Drifter. First of all, the idea that there were people behind the Warframes was controversial to say the least, but it was made all the worse by the idea that actually not only was there a person behind these badass robots, but it was a child. Honestly, this was a weird decision. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always imagined the player base of Warframe would be older, around 16 to 24 and beyond. So the choice to make the player character a kid felt odd. Besides the operator being too young, the original gameplay felt very clunky. Moving around felt slow, especially compared to Warframes, and you were very weak. The whole operator mode felt very pointless and out of place. Later on though, most of this got fixed. Operators and drifters now get access to a bunch of abilities that aid normal Warframe gameplay in some capacity. I also think giving the player the Sirocco made a lot of people realize that AMP gameplay isn't too bad if you can actually get a decent one. The movement does still feel slow, but they made the Void Sling not require crouching, which actually makes it a decent option for closing large gaps, like in the Jupiter tile set. I distinctly remember playing the missions where you fight Void Angels for the first time and thinking, playing as the operator is kind of fun now. Genuinely, this mechanic had a massive turnaround. And before I move on to the next update, we gotta talk about Incarnons and the circuit. First of all, the ability to earn random Warframes through the circuit is such a clever idea for new players and returning players alike. For new players, it's a great way to earn new frames quickly, and for old players, new helmet bait. I really enjoy the idea that the circuit randomly chooses weapons and frames for the player as well, which actually gives us a reason to have multiple things leveled at once, whereas in the past, you could get by with just one weapon and frame. Really though, I want to talk about Incarnons. I love this idea. Instead of buffing old weapons directly, give them a new form that gives them a bit more oomph and some Incarnon trait buffs. As a Soma Prime enjoyer, when I heard it got an Incarnon, I had to get it, and it did not disappoint. All of the new Incarnon weapons I've used are hella fun, and it's just an awesome mechanic. This isn't even the peak of it all though, because it gets better. 1999 is by far the best update Warframe has ever gotten, bar none.
Come away and let's mortify this day. A chilling thought that's haunting me. Can you believe? In the cold, your eyes can feel the fold. You're wearing your disguise again, and rise again, a visionary sin. And when the night falls, you begin to freeze. And when the night falls, I can guarantee, when you couldn't quit, you found a momentary fix, but I'm all you need.
Everything about this update is absolutely perfect. Eleanor? Check. Beautiful tile set? Check. Interesting story with no grind for something I don't care about? Check. New weapons that are fun to use? Check. This update also surprised the hell out of me. Romance in Warframe sounded like a stupid idea that'll never work. But I was wrong. The Kim system is actually very innovative for Warframe and is a great way to develop characters. Kim chats aren't just a few cutscenes or some offhand dialogue from rank ups. It's paragraph upon paragraph of good characterization. But it also helps characterize the Drifter as well. I think a lot of us felt like the Drifter wasn't really us, like it was a kind of a character we just watched. But with 1999 giving us dialogue options, I feel like the Drifter has become more in line with my own character. Sure, it's no Baldur's Gate 3 or Mass Effect, but it's far better than hearing the Drifter say something and reacting to it like Dwight in that one scene from The Office. The Kim system goes beyond just the characterization though. It also helps explain a lot of the lore as well. The thing is, the Drifter is explaining what has happened to them, the lore, to the Hex members. But really, when you think about it, this is also DE quite literally explaining the lore to the player using the Drifter as the carrier. Personally, this has cleared up a lot of things for me. Before Kim, I honestly had no fucking idea what Deviri was supposed to be, but through a couple conversations, the Drifter explains it thoroughly.
When you couldn't quit, you found a momentary fix, but I'm all you need.
yourself out of there.
DE in the past has added many poorly received mechanics and, even after years, kept important loot locked behind them. But with newer content, this isn't an issue anymore. The grind to unlock the Incarnons, the Netrocells, and the Arcanes was fun. I like all of the missions in the new faction areas, so I enjoy doing the grind. It feels like a crime that Arcane Energize is still locked behind Eidolon hunting, or that Hunter mods are still locked behind Cetus bounties, but these days it feels like my time is being respected a lot more because these new updates aren't adding some new garbage nobody likes and then forcing players to engage with it for some reason or another. Before I wrap up this video, I want to talk about boss design in Warframe. I'm just going to cut to the chase here. Bosses in Warframe usually suck ass. Let's take Lephantis as our primary example of how Warframe's boss design fails. Lephantis has a damage reduction mechanic, which makes him difficult to one-shot as your damage against him is capped. This is greatly magnified in Steel Path, where you can spend upwards of 30 minutes wailing on him to no avail. Now granted, if you know about this mechanic, you can build around it, and you can deal with Lephantis in Steel Path no problem. Latum and Mirage make for a good combo against him. But that's where the problem lies. Warframe is terrible about explaining how its bosses actually function. Where exactly is it explained in the boss fight how Lephantis works? It isn't. It might be in the codex, but even then, players shouldn't need to read what is essentially an in-game wiki entry to figure out how a boss works. Good boss design is challenging, but intuitive, and I think this is true for most of the bosses in Warframe. They aren't hard, but I'll be honest, I usually have the wiki open for most boss fights, especially if I haven't done them in a while or ever. But this is where I think Warframe has finally started to improve. First of all, the boss fight against the Void Angels is peak. Perfect fusion of Operator and Drifter and Warframe. I do wish that amp farming wasn't locked behind Eidolons because this boss makes me want to invest more into my amp and maybe try out some other focus schools. And finally, we move on to the best boss design in Warframe, the tank in 1999. This is honestly a very simple boss, but it works. The tank has weak spots which are common in Warframe, and I think for so many bosses it struggles to visually communicate where these weak spots are. But on this tank, they're big green circles and hard to miss. Also, I think the dialogue helps here too, because it effectively communicates to the player the tank is made of some kind of special material that requires special methods to defeat. A lot of the old bosses in Warframe struggle to communicate to the player that the reason they aren't doing any damage is because they're not doing a mechanic correctly. This is made even worse in Warframe because it's rare that players have to do some kind of mechanic against any enemy. Usually it's just shoot until dead. So when the player runs into something that doesn't work that way, and the game doesn't really explain why, it can get frustrating. So I was pleasantly surprised when I fought the tank in 1999, and I was able to complete it without a guide because it was actually straightforward. With the release of 1999, Warframe has entered into a golden era. We're past the open world craze, past the vehicle span, and they've even figured out how to properly do bosses. This isn't to say everything is perfect. D's balance still leaves me with more questions than answers, and like I mentioned before, a lot of important loot is still locked behind terrible content. But I'm excited for major updates now, whereas in the past, I always dreaded thinking what weird new vehicle they'd add or what new open world I'd have to grind. So I hope we can continue on this path for some time to come. I hope DE adds new ideas like the adversaries or Incarnons. I want new content that flows with the old instead of trying to glue on something that doesn't work. Hopefully, DE is able to keep up the good work into Tau and beyond. Thanks for watching.